The barrel of a gun was 6 inches from my face when I finally understood what kind of neighborhood I had moved into. Not from the unsigned note left under my windshield wiper 3 weeks after I moved in. Not from the patrol car that slowed every time I walked my dog. And not from the noise complaint filed on a Friday evening while my guests and I sat in my living room with the music at a volume you'd need to concentrate to hear. I understood it when Officer David Kowalski took a step up my porch stairs, his hand resting on his holster, and said, "Step away from the door, now." I was holding a coffee thermos. I owned every inch of the house behind me. But none of that mattered, not yet. Let me take you back to where this really started. 17 months before that January morning, I signed the papers on 14 Elmwood Drive, and I remember thinking that my hand had never felt steadier. Marcus Webb, architect, 8 years of designing buildings for other people, making their visions real, watching their names go on the plaques, while I drove home to a 2-bedroom rental in a part of the city where the sidewalks needed work and the corner store had a bulletproof window at the register. I was 34 years old. I had a license, a portfolio, and exactly enough in savings for a down payment on the kind of house I had spent my career building for other people. Elmwood Drive was in Haverfield Estates, a quiet, tree-lined suburb 40 minutes outside the city. Older homes, well-kept, 2-car garages, the kind of street where someone power washed their driveway every Saturday morning just because they could. My realtor, Dana, had shown me 6 houses before she pulled up to number 14. She paused before unlocking the front door and said carefully, "The previous owners were the Hendersons. Nice family. 40 years in that house." She said it like a warning dressed up as context. I didn't ask her to elaborate. I already understood. The house was everything I had drafted in my head 100 times. Red brick, a deep front porch with original ironwork columns, a study with south-facing windows that caught the afternoon light like something planned for it. I walked through every room the way you walk through a place you already know belongs to you. I made an offer that afternoon. I closed in 6 weeks. Moving day was the first Saturday of September. My father drove up from Baltimore and carried boxes with the deliberate care of a man who had worked his whole life so that his son could buy a house on a street like Elmwood. My cousin Darius and 2 friends helped with the furniture. We were loud and laughing, and I noticed, even then, even in the happiness of it, the curtain shifting in the window of the house directly across the street. Number 15. I filed it away the way you file away weather. Something to be aware of. My neighbor to the left, Stan Driscoll, came over that evening with a firm handshake and all the right words. "Welcome to the block. Great bones on this house. Anything you need?" I offered him a beer. He declined, but smiled when he did it, and I thought, fine, this will be fine. I grilled that night on the back porch, and my father ate 2 plates and said almost nothing, just looked out at the yard in the fading light and put his hand on my shoulder once before he went to bed. That was enough. The first months on Elmwood were ordinary in the ways I had hoped for. I settled into the rhythm of ownership, small repairs on weekends, a new coat of paint in the study, learning which hardware store in town didn't watch me like I was casing the place when I asked where to find something. I adopted a rescue greyhound named Sterling, and every morning I walked him the same route, down Elmwood, around Birch, through the park. I got to know faces, if not names. The young couple at the corner who ran together at 6 a.m., the retired man 3 doors down who grew tomatoes in elaborate raised beds, the woman across the street whose curtain had moved on my moving day. Her name, I eventually learned, was Carol Harrington. She had lived on Elmwood for 22 years. Carol Harrington smiled at me exactly once in 17 months. It was a smile that didn't reach anything above her lips. After that, every interaction existed at a careful, studied distance. The kind of distance that has nothing to do with shyness and everything to do with decision. She would stop talking when I walked past if she was mid-conversation with another neighbor. She filed a noise complaint the second week of October. I know this because Officer Callahan knocked on my door at 9:15 on a Friday evening, apologetic and visibly uncomfortable, while my guests and I sat in my living room with music playing at a volume a normal person could have spoken over without raising their voice. He checked his notepad, said it had been reported as a disturbance, asked me politely to keep it down, and left without making full eye contact. I turned the volume down to a level that required effort to hear. The evening ended early. By November, I had learned to catalog the patterns. The patrol car that idled at the corner on nights, I came home late. The time I was loading work equipment into my truck, and a man I had never seen stopped on the sidewalk and watched me for 2 full minutes before walking on. The note, no envelope, no signature, slipped under my wiper blade on a Wednesday. Some of us worked hard for this neighborhood. I photographed it, slid it into a Ziploc bag, and added it to the manila folder I had started keeping in my desk drawer. My father, when I told him about the note, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Keep everything, Marcus. Every single thing." He had lived 63 years in this country. He understood things I was still in the process of learning. December passed without incident. I threw myself into a major commission, a community center project in the city, the biggest of my career so far. And I worked late most nights, came home tired, ate standing over the kitchen sink, let Sterling sleep at the foot of my bed. I told myself things were settling. I told myself Elmwood Drive was just a neighborhood, and a neighborhood was just people, and people, given enough time, mostly came around. I believed this with the part of my mind that wanted to believe it. The other part kept the folder in the drawer and noted the patrol car at the corner and said nothing. January 14th arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that presses down flat against everything. I had walked Sterling at 6:30, come back inside, made coffee, and stood in the kitchen for a while just watching steam rise off the mug. I was back at the front door at 7:40, coat on, thermos in one hand, keys in the other, shoulder against the doorframe while Sterling sniffed at something in the planter by the steps. The air smelled of ice and wet leaves. Down the block, someone's car was warming up, white exhaust rising in a pale column. I heard the cruiser before I saw it, the specific sound of a police car pulling to a stop, not the casual drift of someone parking, but the hard, purposeful stop of something responding. 2 doors opened in quick succession, feet on concrete. And then a voice, loud and flat, and aimed directly at me, cutting across the quiet of Elmwood Drive with the particular authority of someone who expects to be obeyed without question. "Sir, stop right there. Hands where I can see them." I turned slowly. 2 officers stood at the base of my porch steps. The one closest, nameplate Kowalski, early 40s, wide shoulders, jaw set like a man who had already decided, had his hand resting on the holster at his hip. The second officer, younger, maybe 25, stood offset to the left with his weapon drawn and leveled at the center of my chest. My thermos was in my right hand. My keys were in my left. Sterling had gone rigid against my leg, silent, the ridge of hair along his spine raised in one long line from his shoulders to his tail. The cold from the thermos burned my palm. The porch boards felt suddenly very far below my feet. The world narrowed to the barrel of that gun in the 2 seconds of total silence, while my brain worked to catch up to what my body already understood. Put down what you're holding, Kowalski said, slowly, both hands. I set the thermos on the porch rail, set the keys beside it. My hands went up, open, palms out, fingers spread. Somewhere beneath the pressure in my sternum and the rushing sound in my ears, I heard it, soft, from across the street. The click of a front door, the quiet hiss of it pulling shut. I did not turn to look, but I knew the sound. I had been hearing the sound of Carol Harrington's door for 14 months. "This is my house," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "I own this property. My name is Marcus Webb. I have ID in my jacket pocket." "Sir, we received a report of a break-in in progress at this address," Kowalski said, moving up the first step. "I'm going to need you to step away from the door." I want to be honest about what happened in my body when I heard those words. The fear was real, cold and physical, a pressure like something pressing inward on my ribs from all sides at once, my heartbeat slamming somewhere between my throat and my ears. But underneath the fear was something else, something sharp and clear and precise, like a lens sliding into focus after a long time of blur. 14 months. 14 months of curtains and patrol cars and notes in Ziploc bags and noise complaints at 9:15 on a Friday. 14 months of telling myself it wasn't that bad, it wasn't personal, it wasn't exactly what I knew it was. And here it was, undeniable. 2 men with guns drawn on my porch because my neighbor had called the police to report her neighbor coming home. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I live here. This is my house, and I am not going to step away from my own front door." Kowalski's jaw tightened. Behind him, the younger officer hadn't lowered his weapon. Down the street, a curtain moved in a window I didn't look at directly. The January morning sat cold and still around all of us. And I stood there with my hands up and my keys on the railing and understood, with complete and absolute clarity, that the next few minutes were going to determine a great deal more than whether I made it to the office on time. I had been keeping that folder in my desk drawer for 14 months. For 14 months, I had photographed notes, screenshotted dates and times, written down badge numbers and car plates in a small spiral notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer between the takeout menus and the spare batteries. My father had told me to. Keep everything, Marcus. Every single thing. I hadn't known, when he said it, that I was building a case. I understood now that I had been building exactly that. "My ID is in my left jacket pocket," I said. "I am going to reach for it slowly. I own this property, and I can prove it. If you would like, I can also provide the deed, the closing documents, and my mortgage statements. They're inside." Kowalski's expression didn't change. The younger officer, Reyes, according to his nameplate, still hadn't lowered his weapon. I reached into my pocket with 2 fingers and produced my wallet, opened it, held my driver's license out toward Kowalski with the address facing forward. 14 Elmwood Drive. He looked at it for a beat longer than necessary. "This doesn't confirm," he started. "That address matches the address on this house," I said, and my voice came out flat and precise. The way my voice gets when I have crossed some invisible line past fear into something colder. If you check the county records right now on that phone on your belt, you will find that this property was purchased 14 months ago by Marcus A. Webb. I am Marcus A. Webb. I am standing on my own porch. I have committed no crime. A silence opened up between us that felt longer than it was. Sterling pressed against my calf, his whole body rigid. Somewhere down the street, a car door opened and closed. I became aware, in my peripheral vision, that two neighbors had come out onto their front steps to watch. One of them I recognized. Tom Gruber, 4 houses down, who grew tomatoes in raised beds and had once waved at me from across the street. He was standing in his doorway with a coffee cup in his hand and a look on his face that I couldn't quite read from where I stood. But I noticed he didn't go back inside. Reyes finally lowered his weapon. Slowly, reluctantly, like a man correcting a mistake he wasn't yet willing to admit was a mistake. Kowalski took the ID and called it in. I stood with my hands still half raised and listened to him speak into the radio, and heard the confirmation come back, and watched his shoulders drop a fraction of an inch when it did. He handed the license back. He said something about a report received. He said the word precaution. He said they were just doing their job. What was the nature of the report? I asked. Caller reported a possible break-in in progress. At what time was the call made? He checked his notes. 7:43. 7:43. I had stepped onto my front porch at 7:42, 60 seconds. She had watched me come to my own front door and had the phone in her hand before I finished fishing my keys from my pocket. I looked across the street. The curtains at number 15 were still. I looked back at Kowalski. I want to know the name of the caller, I said. I can't disclose that information. I understand. You have a good day. I went inside. I set my thermos and keys on the kitchen counter. I sat down in the chair at my desk, and I breathed in and out 4 times with my hands flat on my thighs. And then I picked up the phone and called my father. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened in full, without editorializing, without raising my voice. When I was done, there was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. You okay? He said finally. I'm okay. Good. Then let's get to work. I called the city attorney's office that afternoon. They referred me to an attorney named Patricia Graves, who specialized in civil rights and police conduct, and whose voice on the phone had the particular quality of someone who has heard your story many times and is not surprised and is not dismissive and is very, very prepared. I drove to her office the next morning. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, bookshelves on every wall, a rubber plant in the corner that was aggressively alive. A framed photograph behind her desk of a woman shaking hands with someone official at a podium. She read through my folder while I sat across from her. She turned pages the way surgeons work, no wasted movement, no unnecessary expression. When she set it down, she looked at me directly. This is the 3rd call made to Haverfield PD about your address in 11 months, she said. I went still. I only knew about one. Your neighbor at 15 filed 2 prior non-emergency reports. October 22nd, noise disturbance. February 3rd, she reported seeing an unknown individual entering the property through the side gate. That was a Tuesday. Were you home on a Tuesday in February? I work from home Tuesdays. Patricia Graves set her pen down and folded her hands on top of my folder. Mr. Webb, what happened to you this morning constitutes unlawful detention under color of law. The officers had no probable cause beyond the word of a caller who, given the pattern of calls from this address, demonstrably had a history of reporting your presence on your own property as suspicious activity. That is the legal architecture of a federal civil rights claim. Do you want to pursue this? The rubber plant caught the afternoon light in the corner of the room. I thought about my father's hand on my shoulder the night I moved in. I thought about the curtain across the street, and the note in the Ziploc bag, and the noise complaint at 9:15, and Kowalski saying "precaution" on my own front porch. "Yes," I said. "I do." The next 4 weeks were the most exhausting and clarifying of my life. Patricia subpoenaed the call records from Haverfield PD. What came back was worse and more precise than I had expected. 3 calls in 11 months, each from the same number, each describing, in Carol Harrington's exact phrasing, a suspicious individual at the property adjacent to hers. The February call was the one that stopped me cold when I read the transcript. She had told the dispatcher she had never seen this man before. She had lived 22 feet across the street from me for over a year. Patricia filed a federal civil rights complaint against the city of Haverfield, against officers Kowalski and Reyes individually, and in a separate filing, against Carol Harrington for filing knowingly false police reports with demonstrable racial motivation. The day the complaint was filed, I got a call from a reporter at the city paper. I declined. I got a call from a local TV news producer. I declined. 2 weeks later, someone, not me, not Patricia, uploaded the footage from my front porch security camera to 3 different social media platforms simultaneously. I had not known the camera was at the right angle to catch everything until Patricia watched the footage and said quietly, "Marcus, this is your case." By the time the video had been seen 400,000 times, Tom Gruber had called me. He had been watching from his doorway that morning, he said. He wanted to give a statement. 3 days later, 2 more neighbors contacted Patricia's office. They had watched Kowalski on my porch. They had seen Reyes draw his weapon on a man holding a coffee thermos in front of his own home. They were willing to testify. The internal affairs review of officers Kowalski and Reyes was completed 6 weeks after the complaint was filed. Reyes, 23 years old, 2 years on the force, received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining. Kowalski's file was thicker. 7 prior complaints, 5 involving stops of black residents in Haverfield Estates. His union fought it. It took 11 weeks. But on a Thursday morning in April, Patricia called me at 8 a.m. and said 4 words. "Kowalski is being terminated." I sat with that for a moment. Outside my study window, the yard was beginning to turn green. Sterling was asleep at my feet. "And Carol Harrington?" I said. "She's been charged with filing false police reports. Her attorney reached out last week about a civil settlement. I told them our number." "What's our number?" Patricia told me. I closed my eyes briefly. Then I said, "Tell them yes." The settlement was announced the 3rd week of May. I did not celebrate. I sat on the back porch that evening with a beer going warm in my hand and watched the light fade out of the yard. And I thought about the fact that money does not undo a gun pointed at your chest. It doesn't undo the 14 months. It doesn't give back the particular flavor of that January morning, the cold, the weight in my sternum, the way my hands went up with a muscle memory I didn't know I had. But it makes a record. It makes a fact in the world that cannot be quietly walked back. I had been real estate on Elmwood Drive. Now I was a federal civil rights case. There is a difference between those 2 things, and the difference is not small. Carol Harrington moved out in June. I watched the movers from my study window, 2 men carrying boxes through a gray morning, a truck idling in the driveway. She came out once to direct them and did not look across the street. Her house sold at the end of August to a young family, 2 parents and a daughter who was maybe 4 years old, who waved at me from the driveway the first weekend they were there with a seriousness that made me laugh out loud. I waved back. Tom Gruber brought tomatoes over in September. We stood in my kitchen for an hour and talked about the commission I was finishing and his daughter's college applications and the best hardware store within driving distance that didn't require an act of patience. He drank the coffee I made him this time. My father came back in October to see what I had done with the study. He walked through every room again the way he had the first time. Slowly, touching door frames, looking at ceilings. He stood at the south-facing window for a long time with the afternoon light pressing in around him. And then he turned and looked at me and didn't say anything that required words. I still kept a folder. Old habit, Patricia had said, and smiled. But the folder in my desk drawer was different now. It held the settlement agreement, the IA findings, the printed text of the federal complaint. It held the facts of what had happened, arranged in the permanent language of the law. Not a collection of things to be afraid of. Evidence that what I had built here was real, and documented, and mine. The morning after my father left, I walked Sterling the same route I always walked. Down Elmwood, around Birch, through the park. It was the kind of October morning where the light comes in sideways and turns the leaves into something lit from inside. Sterling pulled ahead with the specific joy of a dog who has no past to carry, only the next good smell. I passed number 15, its new curtains, its unfamiliar car in the drive, and kept walking. The coffee in my thermos was still hot. My keys were in my pocket. My house sat at the end of the block the way it always had. Red brick and ironwork columns and south-facing windows, solid and quiet in the October sun. I had bought it because it looked like something I had drawn 100 times in my head and never expected to own. It still looked exactly like that. The difference was that now I also knew what I had paid for it, in every sense of that word. And I was still here,